Reading from The Unknown Reality by Jane Roberts, a Seth book. This is volume 2, and technically these books, The Unknown Reality, do not go by chapters on purpose. Seth is trying to remove our normal thoughts about the way that books are put together, and hopefully it drives deep into our psyches. The ability to look at things differently. That's not a direct quote, obviously. So this is the first session in Volume 2, Session 705. So Seth begins by saying, let us begin this section with a brief discussion concerning quote-unquote evolution. For now, think of it as you usually do in a time context. It has been fashioned in the past to believe that each species was oriented selfishly towards its own survival. Each was seen in competition with all other species. In that framework, cooperation was simply a byproduct of a primary drive towards survival. One species might use another, for instance. Species were thought to change and, quote, mutants form because of a previous alteration in the environment to which any given species had to adjust or disappear. The motivating power was always projected outside. Okay, it wants us to look to Appendix 12 for this outside. We'll have to do that at another time. He goes on, Seth says, all of this presented a quite erroneous picture. Physically speaking, Earth itself has its own kind of Gestalt consciousness. If you must, then think of that Earth consciousness as grading upward in great slopes of awareness from relatively, quote-unquote, inert particles of dust and stone through the mineral, vegetable, and animal kingdoms. Even then, remember that those kingdoms are not so separate after all. Each one is highly related to each of the others. Nothing happens in one such kingdom that does not affect the others. A great, gracious cooperation exists between those seemingly separate systems, however. If you will remember that even atoms and molecules have consciousness, then it will be easier for you to understand that there is indeed a certain kind of awareness that unites these kingdoms. In your terms, consciousness of self did not develop because of any exterior circumstances in which your species won out, so to speak. In fact, that consciousness of self in any person is dependent upon the constant, miraculous cooperation that exists between the mineral, vegetable, and animal worlds. The inner intent always forms any exterior alteration. This applies on any scale you use. Consciousness forms the environment. The environment itself is conscious. Atoms and molecules themselves operate in their own fields of probabilities. In their own ways, they, quote, yearn toward all probable developments. When they form living creatures, they become a physical basis for species alteration. The body's adaptability is not simply an adjusting mechanism or quality. The cells have inner capabilities that you have not discovered. They contain within themselves memory of all of the previous, in quotes, they contain within themselves all of the previous forms they have been a part of. I would like to make an aside here. In certain terms, you cannot destroy life by a nuclear disaster. You would, of course, destroy life as you know it, and in your terms bring to an end, if the conditions were right or wrong, life forms with which you are familiar. In greater terms, however, mutant life would emerge, mutant only by your standards, but life quite natural to itself. To return to our main subject of the moment, the fact is that the so-called process of evolution is highly dependent upon the cooperative tendencies inherent in all properties of life and in all species. There is no transmigration of souls in which the entire personality of a person, quote-unquote, comes back as an animal. Yet in the physical framework there is a constant intermixing, so that the cells of a man or a woman may become the cells of a plant or an animal, and of course vice versa. The cells that have been a part of a human brain know this in their way. Those cells that now compose your own bodies have combined and discombined many times to form other portions of the natural environment. This inner and yet physical transmigration of consciousness has always been extremely important and represents a natural method of communication uniting all species and all physical life. Inside all physical organisms, therefore, there is a thrust for development and change, even as there is also a pattern of stability within which such alterations can take place. Historically, of course, you follow one line pattern of thought. So you see a picture in which fish left the oceans and became reptiles. From these, mammals eventually appeared, and apes and men. That is, I admit, a simple statement, but it is the way most people think evolution occurred. The terms of quote-unquote progression are tricky. You never imagine the situation being reversed, for example. Few of you ever imagined a conscious reptilian man. It seems to you that the direction you took is the only direction that could have been taken. You identify a highly evolved self-consciousness with your own species development and with your own kind of perceptive mechanisms. You apply these as rules or conditions whenever you examine any other kind of life. In your system of probabilities, there are no reptilian men or women, yet in other probabilities they do indeed exist. I mention this only to show you that the evolutionary system you recognize is but one such system. I just want to pause here. It's so easy to read this right here. It's so interesting to be like, oh, let's just take away this little comma right here, and it would sound completely different. In your system of probabilities, there are no reptilian men or women yet. In other probabilities, they do exist. Do you know what I'm saying? So anyways, syntax. Okay, so sorry, let me go back. We're right here. The physical basis rests latently within your own cellular structure, however. So this reptilian man is within us, and Seth is making a point that we do not have any reptilian men or women going around, but they are latent within each of us. Okay? So anyways, you think that evolution is finished. Its impetus, however, comes from within the nature of consciousness itself. It always has. In some quarters, it is fashionable these days to say that man's consciousness is now an element in a new kind of evolution, but that quote-unquote new consciousness has always been inherent. You are only now beginning to recognize its existence. Every consciousness is aware of itself as itself. Each consciousness, then, is self-aware. It may not be self-aware in the same way that you are. It may not reflect upon its own condition. On the other hand, it may have no need to. So-called future developments of your species are now dependent upon your ideas and beliefs. This applies generally in personal terms. For instance, if you believe that you can live to a healthy, happy old age well into your 90s, then even in Western civilization, you will do so. Your emotional intent and your belief will direct the functioning of your cells and bring out in them those properties and inherent abilities that will ensure such conditions. There are groups of people in isolated places who hold such beliefs, and in all such cases, the body responds. The same applies to the race, or the species to be more exact. There is an inexhaustible creativity within the cells themselves that you are not using as a species because your beliefs lag so far behind your innate biological spirituality and wisdom. Your ideas are beginning to change, but unless you alter your framework, you will continue to emphasize medical and technological manipulations. In isolated cases, this will show you some of the results possible on a physical basis alone. However, such techniques will not work in mass terms or allow you, say, to prolong effective, productive life unless you change your beliefs in other areas also and learn the inner dynamics of the psyche. Now, it is true then that the cells do operate on the one hand apart from time, and on the other with a firm basis in time, so that the body's integrity as a time-space organism results. It is true that on a conscious level you do not as yet operate outside of time, but are bound by it. When you learn to free yourselves from those dimensions to some extent, you are not simply duplicating or, quote, returning to some vaster condition, but adding a new element to that condition. The kind of self-awareness you have is unique, but all kinds are unique. Each triumph you make as an individual is reflected in your species and in its cellular knowledge. In a way, you are all your own mutants, creatively altering cellular formations. When your fate seems dependent upon heredity, for example, then the transmission of ideas and beliefs operates. These give signals to the chromosomes. They cause miniature self-images, so to speak, that are mirrored in the cells. In many cases, these images can be altered, but not with the technology that you have. Basically, cellular comprehension straddles time. There is then a way of introducing, quote, new genetic information to a so-called damaged cell in the present. This involves the manipulation of consciousness, basically, and not that of gadgets, as well as a time reversal principle. First, the undesirable information must be erased. It must be erased in the, quote, past in your terms. Some, but very few, psychic healers do this automatically without realizing what they are doing. The body on its own performs this service often when it automatically writes certain conditions, even though they were genetically imprinted. The imprints become regressive. In your terms, they fade into a probable series of events that do not physically affect you. All right, so that's the end of session, and we've got session notes. Note 3, Rob is saying, go to diagram 11 in chapter 19 of Jane's Adventures in Consciousness book, which I have right here. It's relevant to Seth's material that he just gave. It schematically shows the relationship of the individual birth-to-death cycle, including probable events, to the other successively less differentiated kingdoms or realities that help make up the world. So, let me just show you what that's about. So here is Jane's Adventures in Consciousness, chapter 19, diagram 11. Take a look at that, in case you've never seen that before. And she's got a bunch of little diagrams in this book. And I've mentioned before that she uses different terminology than Seth, but it is basically the same thing with a different approach, a different way of describing it, which is really interesting. Some people might say that it's easier understood by the way that Jane describes these things. Okay, so for diagram 11, it says a focused personality's entire Earth experience as a white hole. Our most specific space-time events lie at the, quote, top of the white hole structure. Our living area corresponds to the event horizon. Okay, I'm losing light again. Or I'm getting light. Anyways, so just take a look at that and think about it. Session note number 4. Rob states, Jane and I understand Seth's point when he tells us the cells of a man or a woman may become the cells of a plant or an animal. And he makes a note later saying that in session 707, which will be coming up in a couple of videos or so, Seth makes his own comments about cells surviving changes of form. So he'll add to that later. For additional material on cellular life and death as mediated by Seth's CUs, or units of consciousness, see the 688th session between 1026 and 1059. And he puts in the little quote where it says, quote from Seth, when the cell dies physically, its inviolate nature is not betrayed. It is simply no longer physical, end quote. Now, I do have that recorded from volume 1. It's labeled Seth, Black and White Holes, Unknown Reality, volume 1688, something like that. You'll be able to find it just based off of Seth, Black and White Holes, if you want to go to that and read that, or listen to that right now. Session note number 6, he's referring to session 654 in chapter 14 of Personal Reality, the book. It contains information on the changing cellular memory, genetic codes, neuronal patterns. Then in volume 1 of Unknown Reality, see the 690th session to 1016 for material on biological precognition. I'm going to put that information up on the screen for you guys to see where you can get that, because I have read that also. And again, it's not the greatest recording, you guys. I'm so sorry. I'd love to just redo everything, but it would just take too much time. And I must move forward, so. Alright, so I'm going to see what I can do about getting session 654 from the Nature of Personal Reality up and linked at some point in this video. Just because it is referencing it right here. Obviously, if you get notifications, it's going to ping up as soon as it's ready, but just know that it goes in relation to this chapter, as Rob is telling us. If we want more information about it, then we would go to it. So up to you whether you listen to it or not. And Like I said, I'll put a link in the video.